So for those of you guys that have had your head in the sand for the past 2 years, ESG has been an emerging topic that a lot of investors in the stock market have been getting into, and specifically companies, which we'll be talking about today, very in depth, like the super major oil and gas companies, learning specifically about how they can transition specifically from natural fossil fuel energies towards renewable energies. Now we're talking about things like wind, we're talking about things like solar, but also you're talking about biomass, you're talking about things that are just sustainable in general, ways to assist with, say, turning waste from renewable to renewable natural gas, like a company that BP just invested in for about $4 billion. We're talking about CCS. You're talking about a huge amount of capital expenditures, which typically used to go towards the typical fossil fuel industry. You're talking about tens of billions of dollars from some certain companies now transitioning to be, say, 30% or up to 50% by 2030 of some of their CapEx budgets. Now we're talking about not just, $100 million or $200 million. We're talking capital expenditure budgets on the order of $10 billion, now 50% of that or more going towards renewables. We're talking about single companies investing billions of dollars into renewable sort of technologies like we're going to be discussing today. So for those of you guys that are unfamiliar with this sort of space, we're talking about companies that are just in their infancy. Some are literally just getting started in their technology, where the companies that we're talking about, the big super major oil companies that we're talking about, are specifically leaning towards companies that are just starting off with new technologies, some of which have established $100 million in revenue and are anticipated to grow extremely quickly at a massive compound annual growth rate. But irregardless of what we're talking about a lot of capital. We're talking about companies that are willing to pay the buck to be able to transition into the next phase of their lives, which is transitioning into international energy companies rather than specifically international oil companies. So today's company, we're going to be talking about Aduro Clean Technologies. It's focusing specifically on converting one-use plastic items that are not able to be broken down or recycled into usable products, whether that is natural gas, whether that is lighter crude oils, and it is using a hydrochemolytic technology that is basically going to use water and heat that is lower than most current technologies, and convert that into hydrocarbons, renewable hydrocarbons, that we can then use in cars or whatever sort of oils or anything that we might need from that. And what we're going to be talking about is the company that is creating the system to do that and the variability amongst the spectrum to provide clients with whatever sort of carbon chains that they want. It's a really cool, interesting presentation, and I'm really looking forward to getting into it with you guys. But before that, I do want to highlight specifically some of the key items. So we're not just talking about, one-off items here. I mean, we're talking about a huge transition of the organizations that were typically focused wholly on the fossil fuel industry, now transitioning to renewables and ESG. And I think that this doesn't get covered enough in the media, and I think that this is an opportune time. I generally don't talk too much about the industry that I work in, but I think this opportunity that we're talking about today with Aduro Clean Technologies is that opportune time for me to kind of bring out a little bit about the industry that I kind of work in. And while this doesn't relate one-to-one, I think that this could be something that you guys can lean into and look for an opportunity, not just with Aduro, but with other opportunities that is likely to come along in this space, because I think it's continuing to heat up, and I've seen it heat up throughout the end of 2021 as well as 2022. So let's just take a minute and look at some of what I'm talking about with some evidence with respect to some of these super majors transitioning. So first and foremost, there was a huge lease sale that happened in March timeframe of 2022, and a lot of that was overshadowed by Exxon just straight up getting a whole bunch of shallow shelf leases near the port of Houston. And what they're basically trying to do is create a huge conglomerate of companies, of 13 or so companies to date, that are going to invest $100 or so billion into this large carbon capture storage area within Houston. So we're talking about $100 billion over the course of decades to be able to basically do carbon storage. And that's something that just doesn't get talked about enough, but it plays into exactly what we're talking about today. You're talking about Shell focusing $2 to $3 billion a year into its renewables and energy solutions or low carbon solution budget. So that's things like solar, things like the Game Changer program, which we'll be talking about today. That's things like their venture program, where they're investing in small startup companies, whether that's to help with oil and gas or whether that's to help with on the renewable side. You're talking about Equinor, which was previously known as Statoil, transitioning to a 4% renewables and low carbon budget in 2020, to a more than 50% by 2030, with their expected gross investments in renewables being about $23 billion over the 5-year period between 2021 and 2026. That is huge, and something that cannot necessarily be scoffed at by any metric. And then, of course, you have Shell, once again, as part of their ventures program, as part of their Game Changer program, selecting Aduro Clean Technologies for their hydrochemolytic technology, which is once again using their technology to deconstruct hard-to-recycle chain growth polymers at temperatures that are normally much higher, but in this case lower, to be able to recycle polyethylene, polypropylene, or polystyrene individually or on a mixed basis, which allows them to be used as feedstock to be able to create other hydrocarbons, whether that's like a crude oil or part of it being natural gas. So it's really interesting story, and it came across my desk from Ryan, and with that, he introduced me to the company. I know that he has bought shares, which makes it a little bit enticing. But I think that there's a few slides in this presentation which I think this is pretty cool to kind of look at initially, because you see the plastics with the turtle. I mean, everyone knows that the great plastic ball that's floating out in the Pacific is out there. So I think that this kind of plays into that a little bit. But there's a few slides with this investor presentation that I think is just absolutely necessary to look through. This is a comment from Forbes. Waste plastics is a growing global issue, creating significant demand for recycling, upcycling solutions. Existing technologies are challenged with the environment, operational, and economic limitations. But obviously, this technology, the HCT that we're going to be talking about specifically from Aduro, is specifically focusing on creating something that's economic. So what's going on here, right? What's exactly HCT? What's hydrochemolytic technology, and what exactly are they doing? So it's high yield, low energy, strong environmental benefits, turning individual plastic waste into high value products already on site. Modular design, fit for business to business. So we're not talking about huge commercial scales yet. We're talking about something that could fit in the size of this apartment. So nothing too crazy. Average 6-year payback. Ideal for a circular sort of economy, and enables businesses to achieve ESG leading performance. There's 6 patents that have been issued. 1 is currently pending, more in development, and all it really is using water. And the chemolytic part obviously is talking specifically about the deconstruction of molecules through some chemicals. So some recent things that obviously we can talk quickly about: third-party independent technology validation, a modular go-to-market strategy. So on their YouTube channel, actually, and I'll put the link in the description for you guys, they just finished their first modular sort of test and has a 3-part production strategy in place to potentially put and build a scalable facilities to produce up to 10,000 tons of fuel or high-value specialty chemicals annually. So it's pretty cool to be able to see how modular this sort of technology can be, and it could be in, like I said, something as small as this room, to be able to reduce wastes, which I thought was pretty cool. So the company itself is really focusing on 3 areas, 2 of which are really going to be able to be used in this initial sort of pilot stage that we're talking about, this modular pilot that is kind of going on, and you can check out more about that on their YouTube page, where they've actually built one of these sort of trains where it takes the plastic feedstock and kind of converts it into the oils or the chemicals and fuels that you might be potentially looking for. And when we're talking about the plastics aspect of things, we're talking about this hydrochemolytic plastic upcycling HPU, which is basically taking the plastics that are one-time use and converting them to the natural gas piece. And it's actually a pretty cool yield that you're getting. You're getting over 80% yield, I think in some cases 90% yield, of which the majority of it goes into being liquids, some of it's going to be into solids, and we'll talk about that in just a second, and some of it's actually going to be a gas. And that's all it is, really. Like, that's all carbon chains are. It's all oil is different variations of the different carbon chains, whether you have methane, which is the simplest, all the way to, say, heptane, which is, 6 or 7 different carbon chains. What you're putting in your car is anywhere between butane all the way to heptane, or sometimes C12 or 12 carbon chains. So it's really just taking these complex plastics that can be multiple carbon chains of up to 20, 30 carbon chains, and breaking it down into the simplest molecules that you can then use in your everyday life. And that's the same thing with this bitumen. Bitumen is just a large carbon chain. And so if you're able to break that down and use it into a lighter crude, and be, say, something that could be moved into a pentane or a heptane, and be part of, say, that normal usage of, say, a lighter crude that's in your car, more of like a West Texas Intermediate that you can use to refine, then you're going to be able to increase the value of your feedstock drastically. Bitumen obviously does not sell for as much. You can use it as something like tars or something like that can be used in road production or on top of roofs, but you can't put it in your gas tank, right? It has to be refined. So with that, if you're able to break it down, then you're going to be able to change what you can get for the value of your feedstock. And that's really what we're talking about with these plastics, this hydrochemolytic technology. So this goes specifically back to the upcycling process. So taking polyethylene or polypropylene sort of plastics, which is then going to be used into a feedstock, putting it into the train, or the HPU as they like to call it. And it's really just breaking it down with water, heat, and basically putting it into gas, liquid, and solid form. So you can see, you're getting a pretty good feed of 90% liquids, whether that's kind of the lower carbon chains, or maybe, up to C20 or something like that. And you're getting some gas yield, some natural gas, as well as some solids and ash that are coming from that. So 2 to 1 or 4 to 1 sort of water to plastic ratio by weight. And then you're operating it by 2,000 to 3,000 PSI, which is kind of cool. It's a little bit higher pressure than I was expecting. But then you're operating about 300 to 400 degrees Celsius, which is pretty cool. And so then you kind of come up with this way to make up and get all these different products kind of coming in through here. You have an ethylene cracker, polyethylene that gets molded into these plastics, which gets recycled, which then you're able to kind of put as an upcycled polyethylene and kind of feed and make up, and then it kind of goes into the circle again. So pretty interesting. So while this is all well and good, I mean, we're just talking specifically about the technology, what's going on, how does this actually end up into margin, right, where you actually make money? So it takes about $22.5 million to create an HPU that processes about 25 tons per day. So you have one train doing 25 tons per day, which gets you about 8,500 tons annually. You obviously have to hire some people to be able to operate that train, which is a cost. Obviously also to run the machinery as well. You end up with a revenue around 7.7 million. So with that, you're able to walk away with about 4.9 or almost $5 million in gross margin. So some of that obviously is going to the licensee who's actually using the technology. So you're getting a gross margin of about 44%. Then the other 1.5 million is going to Aduro. So pretty cool to be able to see. So if you're able to put 9 of these together, you have 9 reactors that are doing 25 tons per day. You're getting about 76,500 tons annually, of which it's going to be 9 times the amount, right? $22 million worth of operating expenditures and all the employees that you're going to have to hire to be able to run that facility. But you're also going to get close to $70 million in revenue, and anticipating a slightly better gross margin comparatively, because you're obviously running at scale. You're going to be able to walk away with about $47 to $48 million in gross margin, of which Aduro is going to be taking about 14 million of that in licensing fees. So how does this look, right? How do we scale this? So this is kind of taking it step by step. On the left, we're talking about, say, 1 train versus getting all the way to 9. And this kind of just shows exactly what we talked about, right? The $7 million in revenue for the 1 train with the operating expenditures, the licensing fee that Aduro is going to be able to take, and then the gross margin that folks are going to be able to walk away with. And it going upscaled, right? So being able to license it out from Aduro and getting all the way to 9 with the $14 million worth of licensing fees, and the CapEx that companies are going to use, about, a decent amount of CapEx, obviously $200 or so million, but being able to walk away with $32 million in gross margin, pretty good. Payback period about 6 years, and you're able to potentially in the future be able to potentially do some carbon credits with this, potentially being able to upsell some of your products associated with it, which is a huge piece when we talk about things like carbon storage. It's like if you're able to make blue steel, which is basically steel where you're able to use carbon capture to reduce the amount of the carbon emissions that you have by making the steel, and you're offsetting those carbon emissions, you're able to upcharge for the steel. It's just like how people might upcharge for a bottle of Coke, where you're seeing the 100% recyclable sort of plastics kind of coming out now. It's the same sort of idea where you have this ESG effort going on, where people might be like, oh, I'll pay an extra 5 cents to make sure it's a recycled bottle instead of like a brand new bottle. Because then you get into the situation where we're talking about now, where you have these hard to break down plastics potentially that would only be able to fill up landfills or the ocean, where now you're able to, say, use those as feedstock. So it helps with the ESG, the sustainable piece of that kind of going forward. So at the moment, there are 2 labs in Canada that are currently in operation, and some planned operational hubs based off the readiness of the technology, as well as some ongoing customer discussions that you can see are scattered throughout the world. So it's pretty interesting to kind of see. Here's a pro forma. Now, keep in mind, Shell did mention that they would be getting involved in the Game Changer program with this. And so because of that, it's likely that they'll be able to provide more of a financing background for this. That's generally when those Game Changer, those venture programs kind of come out. There's a financing aspect of this to be able to help accelerate these technologies, get these technologies to ground faster. And so with that, prior to the Game Changer program, this is from August, so it's a few months old at this point, and I'm sure a lot of this is being redone on a new timeline based off of the announcement with the Game Changer program. But what I wanted to highlight is they're basically test trialing and piloting these current HPUs or trains that they kind of have right now. And so with that, they're going to start going out and doing the customer trials with multiple pilots then. So you're going to be able to get some of these revenues kind of coming in, but obviously you're going to have some expenses because it's currently in the trial stage. And then once you actually build some commercial units, that's when you start to break even. So that was anticipated to be in mid-year 2025. to the point where they actually start getting multiple commercial units kind of up and running to be able to get that feedstock and those licensing fees. So to the point where by 2027, they were looking at about $100 million in reoccurring revenue, of which their margin would be about 78.6 or so adjusted EBITDA, which is basically discounting for the share-based compensation. So you could say, and not too different from what some of these other companies we were talking about earlier that have been bought, $4.1 billion for BP, $2 billion for Shell. Some of these companies are looking out 5 years, 4 years into the future as what the adjusted EBITDA might be. Currently, if you take into account what Aduro is trading for, it's trading for less than $50 million on the Canadian Stock Exchange as a market cap. And so what you're talking about is in 5 years' time, it's going to be eclipsed by that if these targets are met, right? So that is something I would want to recommend to you guys, is to potentially look at the opportunity, but also acknowledge that there is risk associated with this. So as I kind of alluded to, the stock price hasn't really changed too much over the past few months, except for some spikes after some recent news, specifically the Game Changer program with Shell. But 46 million currently, and insider ownership is a huge piece of this, 46%. That's nothing to scoff at. So I do want to acknowledge that 100% there, because that's pretty impressive. And I think that honestly, I could go deeper and deeper, but I think this is an opportunity for us to potentially set up some questions for one of the larger shareholders that I plan on talking to next week or later this week, if you're watching this on Monday, and truly just understand from your guys' perspective what you guys are interested in. I think that this is a unique opportunity. It's something that, like I said, multiple super majors are going to be interested in, or just companies that are in the chemical space in general, or looking for an ESG partner in general. So Aduro does a good job wrapping it up. Why invest now? So it's a unique patented technology that is internally developed, that has been independently validated. High output yield, 80% of whatever plastics you put into it, as long as they're able to be done, are able to be utilized into higher value sort of materials. And that feedstock, which is unusable, low value, is able to be used in a car or be able to be used as natural gas or something of the like. 90% of the feedstock turns into a usable liquid, whether that is designed for, it all kind of depends on what the train is being designed for, but could be used to be transformed into gasoline or something like it, right? Maybe some diesel or something of the like. Operating margins are nearing 50%. Key engagements with Switch Energy in Ontario and Brightlands in the Netherlands for future pilot sites. We've discussed the 13 potential customers across 7 countries, including Fortune 500 companies. Revenue ramp up through commercial development and expected to reach an annual recurring revenue of 90 plus million within 5 years, an EBITDA margin of approximately 80% by year 5. Management's fully aligned, near circa 50% ownership, and eager to increase the shareholder value. 10 years of development, application expansion, rigorous testing. Total capital resources invested up to date is up to about $50 million. And it's undervalued when compared to peers with comparable valuations north of $1 billion. Shows that the company is significantly undervalued. I can't really speak to other companies. I don't know 100%, but what I do know is that they're playing in the $1 billion sort of game right now with a lot of these super majors. And I don't think that that's something that should be under acknowledged. We talked about the amount of capital that's going to be going into these sorts of companies. And if anything goes to show that this is a contender in that, and it's nothing to say just brush off. So I would seriously consider an opportunity like this. Ryan from Independent Investor, I know, has already bought shares himself, and I thought it was pretty interesting. I'm contemplating it myself. I don't normally invest in companies that sponsor the channel, but at the same time, I think this could be a good opportunity. And knowing what I know about the industry, this is a sort of company that I could easily see in 2 years' time, taking some of the funding that they get from Shell, getting their feet wet, getting acceleration of their timeline, and truly getting things kicked up. And once that happens, I saw it happen with Archaea Energy, with BP. I saw it happen with a few other companies where they got bought out. It's really as soon as they get profitable and as soon as they start churning out earnings, that they get picked up. And we're not talking about for $50 million. We're talking about north of $1 billion. In the cases that I'm really thinking about, $2 billion, $4 billion. I'm not saying that this is going to do the same. Obviously, those are the cases that were there, right? And they were a little bit further along in their revenue journey. But I'm just saying this is an opportunity that could be something like that. So hundreds of millions of dollars, $500 million, $1 billion is not out of the realm, especially once you truly get down the timeline. Now, of course, those always come with risks. Not everything is perfect. Companies do go by the wayside. So with any investment, do your own due diligence. And I appreciate that sometimes things don't always work out. But this is in good company. Shell having backed it, they've obviously done their due diligence. Shell is a huge investment in my portfolio for reasons like this. They're good about investing alongside and being first in a lot of ways, and are not afraid to take on challenges and not afraid to challenge the norm. So that's one of the reasons why specifically I'm investing in Shell over something like an Exxon. I like Exxon, but I made my money and I sold half of Exxon, sold 100% of my Exxon, and I took half of that money, I invested it into Shell. And I took the other half and diversified it out of energy because I think energy is a little high right now. But overall, it goes to show you that I doubled down on Shell while I completely got rid of an Exxon because of my confidence in what Shell does and knows. So really hope this was helpful. Hopefully it provided a different perspective, and hopefully you saw a little bit of what I think is a huge theme coupled with an opportunity that I think could be lucrative to some. Now, I'm not suggesting that anybody goes out and immediately buys this. I think if anything, you need to consult an advisor and a professional and think and do your own due diligence prior to pulling the trigger. But hopefully this is something that was interesting to you, and hopefully it is something that if you do your appropriate due diligence, you can consider as a potential investment and at least highlight it to you guys, because otherwise companies like this sometimes go underneath the radar, and you don't find out about them until they're too late. Just like, heck, some of those $4 billion deals I didn't hear about until they were already bought. And had I known about them, I probably, let's be honest, would have invested in them. So this is your opportunity to hear something, whether or not it comes to fruition. Like investing in anything, investing in the S&P 500 to be down, and NASDAQ 100 to be down 30%, even more, 35% at some points. So with anything, it comes with risk. But I think the upside opportunity here, it could be pretty extensive. So as always, guys, I appreciate you stopping by the channel. I'd love to hear any thoughts and comments you have on this one. And I hope to see you guys around for the interview when we have one of the largest stockholders when we have one of the largest shareholders of Aduro Clean Technologies on the channel. So thank you guys for stopping by. Talk to you soon. Cheers.